because this is a symposium that will stand the test of time and be a record of history. So bear with me, because these comments will be a little longer than you might imagine. First of all, Mr. Rector, Mr. Mayor, honored guest, I'm very happy to be here. With respect, gratitude, and much thanks to VATRA and UBT for the opportunity to address this distinguished gathering at this great university on the subject of the role of the Albanian diaspora in the U.S. in the creation of the Albanian state and the declaration of independence of Kosovo, that resulting in there being two sovereign, fully independent states, namely Albania and Kosovo, an incredible achievement. I'm honored yesterday to have received the VATRA Gold Medal, the highest and most historic award in the Albanian world. Thank you, Dr. Rugova. Thank you, Dr. Rugova, who signed the Declaration of Independence of the Republic of Kosovo, by the way. Thank you for so assiduously organizing this symposium, Dr. Harishi, whose academic vision gave this gathering life, Dr. Berisha, who put the subject forward, and to the Academic Council of UBT, and thank you to Jim Gemma, V.B. Barami, who found me in history, Nayam Dechuchek, without whom these events would not have been given their life, and who was at President Rugova's side in history. Elio Ashmetajchez, Nick Mamete, whose decades-long Texas-based, the Texas Gang, the Texas Albanian crew, are legendary in the Albanian American community. And to Alphonse Grisha, without whose recent diverse efforts, all of this group, historic and recent, I undoubtedly would not have the honor to share thoughts with you today. Each one of you, in varying ways, witnessed to the success of the American diaspora's preeminence. I am particularly thankful to Dr. Elmi Berisha for animating discussion on a subject of great interest to him and to myself, that pursuant in part to a short paper I shared with him and discussion we had both on the subject of this symposium. That positive outcome energy characterizes Dr. Berishi and the ethos of what made American Albanians so successful in the United States of America. Dr. Berishi seeks knowledge of history and engages history as path forward, much like Fan Noli and Jim Gemma. This commentary honors the indomitable character of Jim Gemma, the Fan Noli, although different in many ways, of our generation, and nation builder Fan Noli, the Skanderbeg, although very different in many ways, of his generation. Both Albanian American leaders, one at the beginning of the 20th century, the other at the end. Their presence as animators, funders, and leaders of Albanian American diaspora is large in all directions. Noli in contributing much to founding and sustaining Albania, and Gemma in contributing to safeguarding sovereign Albania and realizing independent sovereign Kosovo over the last several decades. Jim Gemma's persona and actions encapsulate the ethos of all Albanian Americans in their decisive role, as my comments will attest, in animating for and attaining Albania and Kosovo independence. I have a unique perspective on the Albanian American diaspora's involvement in the founding day of modern sovereign Albania and modern day sovereign Kosovo. A lifelong Albanian journey that did not reveal its course at once. One that, by recounting the following personal experiences and observations and discussing the milieu from which they emanate, contributes to affirming the importance of American Albania decisive action in history. Beginning in my infancies, I interacted with personalities who animated and subsequently contributed much to sustaining both Albania and Kosovo independence narratives over the last 130 years, an unusual perspective, especially for a non-Albanian American. My comments combine recalling personal experiences with historic facts, and given this perspective, encourage pondering future trajectory, while specifically acknowledging Fan Noli, Anthony Athenas, Jim Gemma, and Ibrahim Bergova, all of whom I came to know, the American Congress, presidency, and citizens who have, for well over 100 years, supported various incarnations of the Albanian cause, and all the countless diaspora organizations and individuals, including those armed. The Atlantic Brigade comes to mind, for whom I had great admiration, who contributed to the Albanian Awakening's arduous quest for Albanian and Kosovo freedom. During the course of my comments, please consider my references to Venerable Vatra as also representative of and applicable to numerous other laudatory organizations that have championed Albanian causes: the Albanian American National Congress, Albanian American Women's Organization, and the Albania Cultural Center in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, among them. I recall having interacted with these groups and others or their predecessors. Consider my references to Albanian leaders as generally indicative of the respect and admiration I have for others. I am reminded of the old, frail man in his bliss at the funeral of what I recall was Jim's uncle. He said to me these words, quote, "Help Kosovo," end of quote. The Albanian American community, to a person, resonated with me. My level of interest was necessarily unique. Corners of the American milieu were often receptive to Albanian America. Without this perspective, one does not fully appreciate the upper hand in some ways afforded Albanian aspirations among a small group of mostly influential Americans for whom the Albanian narrative resonated, that engendering enough cross-pollination to enhance animating success in substantially finding two sovereign states with majority Albanian citizens, and the most recent Kosovo, virtually a near miracle. America had its own, modest though it be, brand of albanologists. Fan Noli and the remarkable Farag Fanaka would have found the cadre in Boston and Cambridge. They were tapping into an American ideal in terms of a group to be receptive to them. The degree to which Albanian freedom movements emanate with successful results from America follows an exceptional pattern well established by numerous American movements and communities. Irish, Greek, Chinese, African, Latin American, Eastern European American communities, among others, when virtually governments in exile existed in America in hopes of ancestral homelands being liberated. I may attest from personal experience that which begins in Irish America forms Irish history, and that which begins in Albanian and Kosovo Albanian America forms Albanian and Kosovo history, having modestly contributed to and as eyewitness to both narratives. Albanian American communities relentlessly and arduously were historically and continue to be motivated to pragmatically engage history due to love of their homeland, common cause with all America's diverse communities. In the late 1940s, literally from my carriage, and thereafter on several occasions over the ensuing years, Albanian history entered my life. I met, my recollections being in the early 1950s, Fan Noli, founder of Vatra, and Anthony Athenas, both of whom my very politically active parents knew, several times at Mr. Athenas's Hawthorne by the Sea restaurant, Swampscott, Massachusetts, located not far from my parents' house. My father interacted with both men, as I recall, on legal matters, with Mr. Noli's church, my parents socially, and with Mr. Athenas travel to Europe. They shared friendships with Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, Joseph Toro, and with Governor John Volpe. As a child, our neighbors, the Bensons, he mayor of, in 1912 of seafaring Salem, Massachusetts, my hometown, gave me a book on famed de Villette Knights of St. John. That leading to Mr. Noli introducing me to Skanderbeg. I played both knights in childhood games in 3 unused rooms on the 3rd floor of our house, one of them laid out as a make-believe Balkans battleground. The Balkan world was very real. It all alternated with the Knights of the Round Table and cowboys and Indians, the latter my heroes, of which that importance later on in this narrative. Both men would find it interesting that today I am both a Knight of Malta and a Knight of Skanderbeg. Both honors never per se sought, but came. Energy put out returns a huge factor in the success of the Albanian American diaspora, of which more anon. Dad, as I grew over, emphasized that Mr. Noli was akin to President Eisenhower and to then Boston's Archbishop Cushing, rolled into one, and that Mr. Athenas supported Mr. Noli in his activities, was the greatest restaurateur in America, both of them authors of history. When we dined in Athena's World, literally restaurant as community center, references to Albania permeated conversations, so much so that I wrote a school paper on, quote, Albania, the hermit country. I wrote others on Ganda's Kwame Nkrumah and Yugoslavia's Prince Paul, regent at the time of Germany's brutal invasion of then Yugoslavia during the Second World War. All of this before the age of 13, 14, or 15. All of this because of what I learned from Mom, Dad, and their friends at the Hawthorne by the Sea. Needless to say, quite early on, I developed a unique perspective on war, liberation, and nationalist movements. In particular, pertinent to this discussion, a perspective on what comprised the complex Yugoslavia narrative. I came to possess the tools to ascertain the role of community leaders, and nationalism in national and international politics. I was well prepared to understand much about Albanian American community in particular. I grasped that Mr. Noli and Mr. Athenas were American patriots who possessed strong commitments to their ancestral Albania home. I was fascinated by this duality, learning of and in real time observing keenly its consequences, amazed that Mr. Noli helped found a country. Imagine as a child being told that. Fan Noli and Anthony Athenas, remarkable American leaders, came to personify in my thinking, along with President John Kennedy and Governor Volpe, the seminal role U.S. diaspora communities play vis-a-vis shaping events in their ancestral homelands. Their actions fascinated me. But equally important, through the story of Fan Noli and Anthony Athenas, I learned the countless reversals that characterize these activities. Joy and tragedy marked the journey. However strong Mr. Noli and Mr. Athenas' commitment to realizing the best for Albania, their efforts over 2 generations were rewarded, sadly, by repressive communism, that being the unfortunate result at the time, no matter how remarkable their moments of success. History for the best intended diaspora was indeed fickle. Clearly one needed to be on guard, albeit even from afar. That said, their concerted efforts and their successes were often remarkable. My learning from them that Mr. Noli in 1912 founded Vatra, and that a generation later Mr. Athenas Thines's support eventually sustained both Vatra and Fanoli becoming much venerated. That Boston was a fulcrum of Albanian independence and for efforts directed against the Albanian communist regime, that most importantly, that the men and women in the support of Vatra and other organizations animated history, animated Albania's independence. Mr. Thines's restaurant, as rallying beacon for Albania America, was during the communist oppression what years later I witnessed at the Bedici brothers, among them Sabet Bedici, Bruno Silimes, Bruno's, and other restaurants were, to the 1990s Kosovo fight for freedom and independence, and what Elio Albanese's Allura restaurant is today in helping to sustain that independence and grow recognition for Kosovo. From these locales and others, I witnessed countless good works espousing the Kosovo Albanian cause. Now, a generation on, I have seen once again numerous community members who I first met at these events. They, to a person, still champion the Kosovo causes. In the 1990s, the Bedici brothers and Bruno's restaurants and others were depositories for donated materials in relief of suffering Kosovo Albanians. In other instances, Albanian Americans hosted congressional leaders. I sat next to Senator Joe Lieberman in the 1990s Bruno's event, and just recently I met then House Foreign Affairs Chairperson Gregory Meeks at Allura. That event organized by Elio Albanese and V.B. Barami, contractor and publisher of Valeria newspaper. Albanian community leaders, businesses, restaurants, contractors, professionals, laborers, waiters, painters, students, and organizations such as Vatra and the Albanian American Woman gave life to the Albanian and Kosovo Albanian lobby in Washington, not to forget political movements in Kosovo. Grace Jim Gemma, Elmi Berisha, was a vital liaison between Jim and President Rugova and Senators Dole, McCain, and other members of Congress, as well as with other Albanian and Kosovo lobbying groups that included, funded somewhat later, Ekrem Barder's National Albanian American Council, at one point headed by Abni Mustafaj. Importantly, considering that they are such a small American community, it was the Albanian Americans diaspora's remarkable success, in particular in nurturing relations with U.S. presidential candidates and with sitting U.S. presidents that made for ultimate success. Roosevelt, don't tread on Albania. Wilson, be independent. We recognize you. Join the League of Nations. Clinton, to the rescue. Bush, we recognize you. Trump, bring them to the table. And Biden, we love you. I saw the direct line between the local to the presidential. My parents traveled to Europe on a New England trade and travel mission with Mr. Thienes, led by their mutual friend, then soon-to-be governor of Massachusetts, John Volpe. Mr. Thienes championed an Albanian refugee cause when Governor Volpe, who went on to form part of Nixon's cabinet, came to dinner at my parents' house. A rumored possible vice presidential candidate, while ambassador to Rome, Governor Volpe was attentive to Albanian issues. Albanian Americans take every opportunity to state their case to power. When in the late 1950s, I told Mr. Noli that one day I hope to attend high school in Switzerland and visit the Mediterranean ports that Cleopatra's barge called on during her famous voyages from Salem, Massachusetts, we discussed Albania's proximity. The Orthodox Church just down the street from my grandmother's house was familiar to me as a first grader, and in part because of Archbishop Noli, who must have had a relationship with that church, and my father running for mayor of Salem. I may not emphasize more how much I came to fully understand and very much admire how organizations such as Mr. Noli's Vatra and others, from the ground up, from the local community up may accomplish great works, even to give birth to nations. Watching attentively the adults around me, I also wanted one day on matters of importance to speak to power in its various forms. Several years later, in 1966, at the end of high school studies, just after Mr. Noli's death, I traveled the Eastern Balkans by train from Istanbul to Vienna. The Western Balkans were, as you well know, impossible. It was my third trip behind the Iron Curtain, my first in 1963 alone with two 15-year-old friends to Prague, my second in 1963 to Moscow with my brother and father. Sharing stories of my Balkans train journey with our Hamilton, Massachusetts hilltop neighbor Alice Coffin and her sister Julia Brambila, who became a mentor, they explained the role of their father, George von Almeida, played in setting President Roosevelt's interest in the Balkans, Albania in particular, that emanating from Ambassador Maya's tenure as our embassy to Rome and Moscow in the first decade of the 20th century. Shortly thereafter, Julia and her husband, Giuseppe, lived in Athens, where he was Italian chargé d'affaires. My family lived in the Meyer house. Julia introduced me to Alice Roosevelt, both of them recalling that her father, President Roosevelt, was offered the Albanian crown. I was thoroughly amazed. I couldn't believe it that an American president could be offered the crown of a foreign country. They both knew Fanoli. Both Meyer and Roosevelt, who were friends at Harvard, were very attuned to community politics. Roosevelt had been New York City police commissioner, Meyer a Boston city councilman. They knew, as did my father, a Salem city council president, every immigrant group. Theirs was a robust, inclusive, embracing, optimistic, reform-minded nationalism of the kind that would resonate with Fanoli, and the spirit of much of the Albanian awakening, that attracting Albanian Americans to Roosevelt. All politics are local. Albanian Americans know this time-honored tenet well, much to their credit, much benefiting them. Julia attended the Paris Peace Conference. Her husband, chief assistant to then Italian Prime Minister. Julia attested to the unequivocal support Wilson gave Albania, that predicated on amazing political initiatives fostered by the very small, indeed, Albanian diaspora. Controversial and sadly racist, Mr. William Loeb of Manchester Union newspaper fame, who did, by the way, Senator Dole in, the maker or breaker of U.S. presidential aspirations, whose father was chief secretary to President Wilson, discussed Mr. Noli and Albania with me in the early 1970s or early, affirming the degree to which Noli's Albanian American initiatives permeated the highest levels of American government in the first decades of the 20th century, that assuring American recognition of the Albanian state by President Wilson. Historic precedents and personal connections brought these often Eastern establishment personalities to the Albanian cause, uncovering the hands that facilitated Fanoli's and Fanaka's Harvard matriculation would contribute to serving our story well. A partial explanation of this remarkable bit of history emerged due to my keen interest in America's first national architecture, Greek Revival, that a built world response to the British colonial period Georgia. It turned out that America's attentiveness to Albanian aspirations runs much deeper than all of us might realize. The founding fathers turned to ancient Greek for much inspiration, that in quick order resulting in support for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire, that conversely, among a very rarefied group of Eastern establishment types, conversely morphing into an interest in matters Albanian. Listen to this following bit because it's quite fascinating. Albanian Americans such as Fanoli, in fact Fanaka, who was born in northern Greece, I surmise, judiciously employed this connection. My then soon-to-be sister-in-law's mother, Octavia DuPont Braden, herself, I was told in the 1960s, having been pursued as consort to King Zog, believe it or not, due to my interest in Greek revival, introduced me to Jimmy Biddle, then or about to be head of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who lived in America's first Greek revival house. His ancestor, I learned from him, Nicholas Biddle, was the first American to record memories of visiting Greece. He was the first American to write about Albanians. That in 1906, when he was private secretary in Europe to James Monroe, later president. I studied the geography of then Yugoslavia at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, including much about Albanian communities throughout the region. Nicholas Biddle noted that there were countless villages throughout Greece. Listen to this, it's very important. Nicholas Biddle noted that there were countless villages throughout Greece where only Albanian was spoken. Most intriguing for this then student was that he described Albanians as the Native Americans of the region. That description greatly enhanced my regard for the Albanian ethos and story. Fan Noli and Anthony Athenas became that more courageous in my eyes, native sons of ancient residents fighting oppression, timelessly committed to their cause. Their story focused with that of America seeking liberty in the world. However, unjustly and tragically, the same story did not coalesce towards Native Americans. The Biddle observation, joined by others, is the narrative, one further encouraged by a 19th century fascination with arts, travel, and poetry related to the left.
You got to bring the students here. You gotta have students. This is how many pages?
Well, it's supposed to be a scientific, historical thing. Don't you want to? You don't want to hear the history? Do you? I just want to know how many people do not want to hear the history.
I swear, Almighty God, I know 80% of you involved.
What? No, I mean, if it's a scientific thing, yeah. I'm giving the details if you don't. Okay. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
I say because I love you, but I understand.
Yeah.
I got a million obligations.
Okay, go. I don't mind.
I got to meet the priest up there. And
please go. I'll finish alone. It's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know. You got to give it to me. I'm going to read it.
All right, good. I will. Thank you, Jim. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. So that description greatly enhanced my regard for the Albanian ethos and story. Fan Noli and Anthony Athenas became that more courageous in my eyes. Native sons of ancient residents fighting oppression, timelessly committed to their cause. Their story focused with that of America seeking liberty in the world. However, unjustly and tragically, the same story did not coalesce to Native Americans. In tandem, the then fledgling Albanian American diaspora, their efforts enhancing movements in the Albanian world, nurtured, encouraged, and propagated the Albanian language, culture, traditions, and aspirations for freedom. They set in place supporting elements in America that much nurtured the milieu from which leaders such as Fan Noli and organizations as Vatra and others could emerge. They, in turn, persistently engaged the American political leadership, fueling ongoing the march to Albanian independence and ongoing march to Kosovo independence. As a result, almost all 20th century American presidents would, when history calls, nurture, encourage, support, and defend the independence of Albania, and in recent decades, the independence of Kosovo. Fan Noli and Konoik found fertile ground at Harvard, that originally planted and nurtured in Philadelphia and Princeton by Nicholas Biddle, Much as Fanoli, Mr. Thenis, and Mamandard provided me with fertile ground from which to act when my brief moment presented itself to animate for Kosovo, a cause I believed then presidential aspirant Bill Clinton should be part of. The injustices perpetrated against Albanians before independence were horrendous, intolerable, unacceptable. I prayed during 2 pilgrimages to Mount Athos for peace and understanding to manifest itself. That suffering, amplified by American Albanian diaspora, moved American leaders to action, as Jim explained. When I ran in 1973 for the Great and General Court of Massachusetts, senior members of the extensive Ipswich, Massachusetts Greek-American community described Fanoli and Vatra as key to the American recognition of Albanian independence, also making it clear that Vatra was synonymous with inclusiveness, recognizing as Albania individuals of all faiths. That tenet tantamount to making support for Vatra viable in several quarters of the American political community. And Elmi, of course, knows this very well. Much later, in 1985, I sailed a portion of the coastline of then Hawksness communist Albania. The communist world was already very real to me. I understood as a schoolboy the role of the diaspora groups played against the brutal communist opposition. Given these and other extraordinary introductions to the Albanian world, I was uniquely prepared, fate-formed, and very much willing, both before on my own and later officially, after I was appointed Deputy National Political Director in charge of ethnic constituencies for the first Clinton campaign, to identify, or absent that, establish support from the ground up among Albanian Americans for the then Governor Clinton's quest for the presidency. Several years before my appointment, having told Clinton when we were undergraduates at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service that I would help him when he ran for president, I began researching, among other communities, the then leadership of the Albanian American community, purchasing a copy of Valeria, proving very helpful. In his book, My Life, Clinton memorializes my purchase of numerous ethnic American newspapers in order to identify leaders and organizations, writing, quote, "My outreach to ethnic communities was organized by Chris Hyland, a Georgetown classmate who lived in Lower Manhattan, one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods in America. Chris started by buying about 30 ethnic newspapers and locating the leaders mentioned in them, moving to Little Rock to organize ethnic groups across the country. As I began to gear up for the pre-official campaign period, I found little or no support for Clinton among Albanian Americans. President George H.W. Bush's strong 1992 letter in support of Kosovo, in which he warned Serbia and Russia of American intention should Kosovo be harmed, characterized the sympathy the Bush administration had for Kosovo. Bush support was generated and or enhanced in great part by Jim Gemma's efforts and those of others. Jim then recently having begun work in support of influential war hero Senator Bob Dole, a personal hero of mine. Senator Dole, at Jim's invitation, visited Kosovo in 1990, sealing the American commitment to Kosovo. Jim, the spirit behind that seminal energy. President Bush was well respected, he and President Reagan having stood up to communists. After some cajoling, very early on in the effort, Gemma agreed the merits I presented, namely that the unknown Bill Clinton was electable against seated, then popular Bush, a third candidate most likely assuring that outcome. Jim supported Clinton with gusto. Of that period, Jim recounts, quote, Senator Dole urged us to support Clinton. Just in case Bush loses, we have Clinton. to be cautious, to be practical. No one knows who will win. That was the best for Kosovo's cause, end of quote. Up until this time, the Albanian diaspora had made some inroads into the Republican hierarchy, generating some bipartisan congressional support in the 1980s, with Bush support emerging. The same could not be said for the Democratic side of the aisle. Initially, so extensive was Bush support, it was rough going. Ilaria, then the recently founded Albanian international newspaper of record, was at first very skeptical. My campaign efforts illustrate the degree to which Albanian American community engaged American politics. Yes, I pushed on, they responding, my mounting a huge effort, meeting with Albanian and Kosovo Americans from Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, Texas, and elsewhere, all the while encouraging them to act directly with Clinton officials. And the point is, they did. They directly interacted with Clinton officials. I invited community leaders to numerous events. The Clinton-Milwaukee Foreign Affairs speech introduced them to Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, George Stephanopoulos, other campaign officials, put them on the committees, one at Bill Clinton's sit-down dinner for 900 at the New York Sheraton, another dinner for Hillary that Alice Walton of Walmart fame and Jim Gemmer and I hosted. The Albanian community attended in force. Of these events, Jim says, quote, absolutely positive. I've worked with countless senators. John McCain was on television every day. Chris and I hosted Hillary and Bill Clinton. I wrote the first official vetted and approved communications to the Albanian world from Clinton world. That was tough to get done, believe me. Total opposition, faxing one text extensively and delivering the other during a speech I gave at a large Kosovo rally near the United Nations. I spoke at a Bronx rally. They made sure I had place for voice. I introduced Albanian Americans to Senator Glenn Moynihan and other members of Congress, faxing in all directions. You know how I do that, and with emails. And after victory, invited them to participate in the Little Rock Clinton Presidential Transition Eastern European Conference. This was a major change in things, bringing Albanian Americans into the fold, into the presidency. They were proactive to a person, positive and totally engaged. Each engagement incrementally, brilliantly responded by the Albanian American community, sealed a relationship between the diaspora and what would soon be the most powerful political team in the world, the new Clinton presidency. Anthony Lake indirectly, Sandy Berger and Nancy Soderberg directly would all, by the time I was finished, be well aware of the small Balkan region they virtually at first, it would seem, knew little about. My efforts were extensive, yes, but all these comments affirm the huge effort in return energy the Albanian American diaspora exerted to gain support for their cause. If Albanian Americans had not engaged me and others, if the diaspora were not focused, active, committed to making history, none of the foundation would have been in place to allow contemporary, let alone past personalities to emerge primed and prepared to act when most needed in 1990, 1998, 1999, and then later in 2008, and along the entire historic journey. When the time came, Jim Gemmer recalls, quote, Dole called up Clinton and asked for action, end of quote. Senator Dole told me much the same. Years later, in 2022, individually and collectively, members of founding President Rugova's family told me that Jim Gemmer is a founding president of Kosovo. Ever present during my entire Clinton presidential campaign involvement with the American Albanian community was their persistent demand that Kosovo be recognized as independent and sovereign. Grace, Mr. Noli, and Mr. Athenas, I understood the deep history behind this goal. The halls of Congress were alive with this resounding message. It was often assiduously conveyed and advocated in the decade before Kosovo independence by Elmi Berisha. Now, decades later, venerable Vatra president, working in tandem with Jim Gemma and other members of the Kosovo lobby, Niam Tucek among them. Niam, at first political efforts, later coalesced into the Albanian Diaspora Business Network. They and Kosovo, Washington-based lobby groups persistently to this day, repeatedly told in those days to Senators Dole, McCain, Congressman Engel, and other members of Congress, free Kosovo, free Kosovo, free Kosovo. I recommended to Clinton in person, face to face, also passing him a note on the subject just before his April 1st, 1992 first New York Foreign Affairs campaign speech that he announced support for Kosovo independence. He, in his comments, mentioned other areas of the former Yugoslavia that I suggested he recognize, but not Kosovo. I wrote in a memo to senior Clinton staff, and obviously to Clinton, not advocating the recognition of Kosovo would result down the line in dire crisis. I repeated the same advice to Clinton during Atlanta campaign dinner, also sending a follow-up memo on the same subject to him and senior staff. In White House conversations with Sandy Berger, one over dinner during the Ukrainian President Leon Kuchma's November 21st, 1994 White House State Dinner, I stressed a dire future if Kosovo was not addressed, ideally immediately recognized. I left and felt that night in the White House State Dining Room, as I did in other meetings I had in the West Wing, as if the Albanian diaspora was by my side. Senior Clinton players, evincing elitist disdain, found my concerns for small American communities amusing, underestimating especially their role in high electoral states, election victory impact, and underestimating the wisdom found among community leaders. For most of them, all politics were not local, not like my dad, not like Roosevelt, not like the others. Their interest was Wall Street, and that was it. The night of Clinton's first presidential victory, the then president-elect made it very clear to me that he understood the role ethnic communities made in his victory, he pointing out to me the high electoral college results on the screen. My concerns and insights regarding Kosovo proved within a few years in 1998-1999 prescient, when responsible players, most importantly Clinton, eschewing NATO restrictions, acted by leading the alliance to save Kosovo, an altruistic moment in an otherwise cynical milieu, a major step to Kosovo independence, much animated by the Albanian diaspora, myself a witness to this history. President George W. Bush, as if bookend to his father H.W. Bush's initial support, recognized Kosovo as independent sovereign state some 9 years later. Ironically, when Russ Reynolds introduced me to George H.W. Bush at the beginning of his first presidential campaign, I stressed the importance of the ethnic vote. He went on to lose his second term due in part to inattentiveness to these communities. In a private meeting with courageous President Rugova, conversing in French with much cigarette smoke, we discussed in great deal President Roosevelt, President Wilson, and Fanoli, and the desire for Kosovo independence. He confirmed his reliance on the much appreciated Albanian and Kosovo Albanian American fundamental support so to achieve. He discussed George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole, Jim Gemma, Bill Clinton, Serbia, the importance of accommodation, my proposal that Dekane and Pest be fully autonomous, the unhappy state of religious extremism in the world, Illyria, Stones, Pierre de Chardin, eternal Dardania, and the founding of Rome, and the hope that one day I would visit Pristina, among much more. President Rugova spoke of the tantamount role Kosovo Albanian Americans and Albanian Americans from other areas of the Balkans played in assuring the ongoing viability of the Kosovo independence movement, including the work of his Kosovo political party, the Democratic League of Kosovo, a branch of which was active in America, itself a fulcrum of freedom movement. President Rugova impressed me by the degree to which he simultaneously, unequivocally served as Kosovo's irrefutable independence voice, and also served to encourage laying the groundwork for future pragmatic cooperation in the region. Not once did President Rugova allude to Kosovo being anything but sovereign and independent in perpetuity. As an intellectual who studied the impact of beauty in the world, President Rugova understood that the greatest beauty is the success of the human experiment, the communal success that comes with prosperous, content citizens. He knew that the hope of attaining that beauty in life for the citizens of Kosovo was, in his words, translated from the French, in great part due to the diaspora and their friends, end of quote. In the enormous puff of cigarette smoke that I left him in, we parted, his last words to me, Dardania. The magic of Dardania has captured me ever since, my most recently seeing President Rugova's Dardania plaque in the Mother Teresa Cathedral he designed, itself a symbol of multicultural society that President Rugova espoused. That, not unlike the multifaceted America in which the Albanian American diaspora thrives. The success of the diaspora in multicultural America informed the fight for freedom. At a subsequent Albanian American event in the Bronx, New York City, President Rugova and I raised our intertwined hands in a show of mutual commitment to Kosovo, freedom, and independence. Given the feedback I was experiencing against Albanian America from Clinton world, my action was bold. Our raised hand together gesture illustrated the fusion of Kosovo-Albanian intent for freedom with support from a person myself from the broad non-Albanian political world, in this instance with an official of what would soon be a winning presidential campaign, one who the Albanian community engaged, one who realized that the call for fairness in the treatment of all peoples is the good cause. I was hoping to galvanize voters for the good, in this instance around Bill Clinton, in the hopes that his future actions would support that good. They did. Albanian Americans know how to identify support and, for the most part, nurture it and sustain it. My persistence in masking Clinton camp leaders' exclusionary attitudes, which Jim knows very well, towards hard-working Americans, and my persistence in approaching numerous members of the Albanian American community fostered discussion, giving introductions, moving them into positions from which they could in future express opinion. It all coalesced. I was always sending out memos to campaign leaders, faxing in all directions. Also, Senator Joel suggested, as to be on the safe side, that Jim give support to Clinton. Illyria, the newspaper found by Ekrem Brada, now owned by Vibi and Eugenia Barami, but during the first Clinton presidential campaign, owned by Harry Bakhtiari, who went on to be a huge Kosovo advocate, gave increasing attention to matters Clinton. I persuaded Bakhtiari to support Clinton. And I was happy that I did. Introducing him to Hillary, introducing him to Bill, all around introducing him, and inviting him to Little Rock to represent Kosovo's future in the Eastern European Environment Conference. So strong had the ties become that sometime after Clinton's victory, he would attend what in effect was an Albanian American victory dinner in his honor, a long way from not allowing Albanian Americans to join committees. So successful were these efforts and others that subsequently my nephew, who at some point was chief of staff to the then co-chairpersons of the Republican Party, later pointed out, as did the press, I believe the New York Times, that President Bush hastily, belatedly appointed a cabinet secretary midway during his campaign in an effort to counter my efforts and those I animated through members of numerous ethnic communities, among them, of course, organizations such as Vatra. After Clinton's victory in the mad rush for influence, it was convenient for ill-intended players who wanted space, sowing discord to silence, even remove pro-Kosovo voices from the community, mine among them. Though I never ceased to advocate, never giving up, I advocated every moment espousing for Kosovo. Though some of our efforts might have been sequestered, the foundation still growing, the community still engaging Clinton world was in place to give support when history provided opportunity, as it did in 98, 99, and 2000, and ongoing. There were diaspora setbacks. Clinton's beneficial in some ways to other areas of the Balkans, Dayton Accords. Clinton's beneficial in some ways to other areas of the Balkans, Dayton Accords, and the then knowingly or unknowingly somewhat, but by no means all, seemingly pro-Serb and pro-German team that fostered them set the foundation for the present Serbia, unfortunate for Kosovo, dangerous Serbia, German, China, Russia vortex. Balanced, credible, animated, seasoned Kosovo voices connected already to the center of power, such as mine, were excluded from the discussion in part by an outmaneuvered diaspora, and their erstwhile history would prove ill-advised partisans. It was very sad for me to watch my realizing, although by no means the same situation, that Noli and Athenas must have felt due to the communist setback they experienced. Duplicity unchecked undoes the very best of intentions, but even this experience manifests the diaspora's power. The unhappy for Kosovo, Dayton Accords aside, ultimately, when history compelled action in the late 1990s to save beleaguered, destitute Kosovo citizens wandering rough in the highways of Kosovo and Albania, and later in 2008, the actors were in place, graced the large part of the Albanian American diaspora and their supporters to move into action, to rise to the historic occasion. As confirmed by my own actions and observations, and as corroborated by Senator Dole on the subject during a conversation I had with him, Kosovo independence was in the main, to the extent America was decisively involved, substantially assured by the actions of the Albanian American diaspora, by Vatra, other organizations, political in nature as well, by key individuals, foremost among them Jim Gemma, but also by countless selfless actors in different capacities along the way, by both pen, exemplified by every call, letter, fax, or more recently email to an Albanian restaurant Kosovo fundraiser, and or by arms, exemplified by the Bedici brothers, Yuli, Agran, and Mehmet, the ultimate American diaspora sacrifice, each to their appointed tasks, some facilitating purposely, others quite by chance, the journey often at critical points. Americans interacted also with effective Albanian interlocutors. All of the above is best amplified by several among us today. Naam, who both in American and Rugova's side tireless fostered Kosovo interests, now through the Albanian Diaspora Business Network. Elmi, who served as Kosovo conduit and advocate to Senator Dole's office and others in the decade building up to the declaration of Kosovo independence. Ilaria, keeping editorial presence up, by George Romanos, perennial journalist, by Hillel Mula, Frank Screcci, who went on to head the National Albanian American Council, and by effective Kosovo Albanian interlocutors such as Ambassador Avni Spanu, who, when I met privately with President Rugova at the New York Hilton Hotel, was traveling with him engaging the diaspora. He would serve as Kosovo's first ambassador to the United States of America. When Serb spitefulness shut down Kosovo, the Albanian diaspora funded schools and food distribution. They sustained life. There is no myth here, no exaggeration, only the hard reality that members of the Albanian American diaspora and others, many of whom position, most importantly, candidates for the U.S. presidency, such as Senator McCain and Dole, and presidents such as two Bushes and Clinton, they contributed greatly to assuring action was taken when Dardania called. Virtually not one among them, including myself, that animated all of this, professional politicians. I'm reminded of Stephen Walsh's book, The Beloved Vision, in which he points out that according to the Financial Times, quote, for a century and a half, European society produced the greatest music the world has ever known. Many of the composers lacked credentials. The same may be said for the Albanian American diaspora. They were not politicians and generals. They were and still are driven by moral imperative, imbued with vast amounts of civic virtue, such animating them to do the right thing, their weapon against oppression, often deadly political cultures. Swiss thinker Barth believed that Mozart's music humanly reaches beyond the angels towards God. There was something of the divine ordained in the collective as well as the individual actions of the Albanian American community's liberation odyssey. Something Homer would write about, Byron embraced, and hard-working immigrants and their friends found compelling and life-fulfilling. It was an incredible display of human strength. Barth wrote, quote, for things are ruled not just in Moscow or in Washington or in Peking, but things are ruled even here on earth entirely from above, of two splendid, separately sovereign, democratic, multi-ethnic, majority Albanian states, a commonwealth of interest they may form, but not a state. I commissioned what he insisted upon naming the Highland Mass from Maestro Joseph Vella, in part to memorialize all the communities I worked with during the Clinton campaign, the Albanian American very prominent among them. Its existence is an outcome of their energy, an excellent instance of cultural fusion, an enormous wellspring of indestructible hope emanated from the Albanian American diaspora, that a symphony of positive energy, often facing great cynicism and overcoming it. The Mass memorializes that. The desire for equitable peace advocated by many among the diaspora will, I very much hope, be further kindled tomorrow night when the Mass in concert is performed, courtesy of Jim Gemma, by the Kosovo Philharmonic Orchestra and Choir to honor Grace's heroic actions from all quarters, 15 years of Kosovo independence. Although much of Clinton's tenure was marked by cynicism, his belated yet decisive Kosovo involvement demonstrated the highest level of commitment, the highest level of energy. Ultimately, the greatest testimony affirming the vital ongoing role of the Albanian diaspora in sustaining the constant interaction with decision makers that led to the founding of the modern era sovereign Kosovo state appears in Bill Clinton's autobiography, My Life, when he wrote of my efforts during the campaign. And these are of the Albanian community's efforts, quote, making an important contribution during the campaign, during the general election, laying the foundation for our continued unprecedented contact with ethnic communities once we got to the White House. Senator Dole echoed the same refrain, telling me, quote, we all ended up speaking to one another about Kosovo. Jim recalls, quote, Dole called up Clinton and asked for action, end of quote. I spoke to power on this issue in a Little Rock restaurant to then Secretary-designate Warren Christopher. Quote, Secretary Christopher, address Kosovo, meet with them, end of quote. And in a small Washington apartment just near the Hilton to soon-to-be Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, quote, Kosovo cannot be ignored, end of quote. this years before any action was taken. The persistent contacts President Clinton writes about and Senator Dole spoke about, much made by the Albanian American diaspora and their supporters before, during, and after the campaign into the Clinton presidency, culminated in assuring that the United States of America in 98 and 98 came to the rescue of beleaguered Albanians. It is an honor to have been and to be participate in the Albanian awakening manifest among Albanian Americans seeking independence and free societies for their ancestral lands. That driven by the overriding importance of nonpartisan freedom for all. This very smallest of American communities and their leaders faced and still do these 130 years the might and prestige of the European powers. In the beginning, their mother tongue having just recently been alphabetized, successfully sustaining efforts that diplomats in London and Dayton could not undo or ignore, empires could not hold on to or contain, dictatorships could not suppress or crush, and their own complex social traditions could not impede or outweigh. It remains that they stay the course. The nobility of the Albanian story, the Albanian Kosovo story, of the Albanian American story, award us all with hope. I was and continue to be participant, witness, or I knew the individuals directly involved in at least some of the actions that make the following statement quite justified. Without persistent, unrelenting, focused Albanian American diaspora efforts present in all American political spheres, now for some 130 years on in America, most likely there would not be a Republic of Kosovo, and the birth of modern-day Albania would have been far more arduous. Albanian America has much to be thankful for. Their success is amazing. Wilson, through the U.S., did not join the League, even though the U.S. did not join the League of Nations during the 19 and 20 Paris Peace Conference, emphatically assuring Albanian independence no matter the scurrilous secret agreements of European powers. And the two Bushes and Clinton incrementally recognizing Kosovo, no matter the prohibition against NATO troops being employed outside of NATO. Jim Gemma's words speak volumes. My dear Albanian Kosovans, what is happening in Ukraine is what would have happened in Kosovo if it were not for Dole and Clinton and the work Chris and I did. Vigilance guides the Albanian American successes. That advocacy ethos, a de facto charitable-based American Albanian fund in gestation, an aspiration I've advocated now for 33 years. A lot more than delicious food was served at Mr. Athena's Hawthorne by the Sea and at countless other Albanian American restaurants, making independence history what it was served, a staple on the menu, ongoing 130 years. Ongoing today, the American Albanian diaspora realized that independence must be safeguarded. Much of the diaspora espoused without peace, full prosperity will not be achieved. They engage political leadership in all qualities to fully accept the Republic of Kosovo as permanently, irrevocably sovereign independence. They advocate achieving a modicum of harmony and encouraging the pursuit of practical matters of mutual interest to both Kosovo and Serbia. This most probably morphing into, as I have advocated 30 years on, a way forward, a Balkans Commonwealth, not a federation, not an economic union, but a commonwealth of fully sovereign states serving as permanent forum for the exchange of ideas, even among enemies, an incubator for region-wise products, a reasonable step forward. Not to do so perpetuates political and economic instability and risks submitting Kosovo to historic, ill-intended European and world forces. It encourages general trepidation among the world community of sovereign jurisdictions, they often relinquishing sovereign prerogatives. Among nonprofits, the technology, insurance, mining, and banking sectors, and the corporate world in general. We must give them a sense of security. Albanian America has served and continues to serve as the bulwark against unhappy prospects now more than ever. The Albanian American diaspora's persistent, decisive actions in the creations of sovereign Albania and sovereign Kosovo is a tribute to heroism, sacrifice, and love. They affirm that it takes a multiple of people to achieve success, all needed to roll that boulder up the hill, all part of something bigger than themselves. The Albanian American diaspora's efforts deserve to be placed ahead of the greatest persons whose actions, for the most part, animated Albanian and Kosovo history, that largely predicated upon the brilliance of a very small, often marginalized and persecuted community committed to freedom. We want to celebrate that achievement by allowing freedom to give way to peace. Peace now, the Albanian American and Kosovo American mantra, that is the sacred goal. Dardania lives. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Highland. Për shkak të ndryshimit të agjendës, kjo është konferencë shkencore dhe lus folësit e radhës të këtij sesioni pune që ta respektojnë kohën e paraparë. Atëherë ftoj ambasador Flamur Gashin, i cili do të paraqitet me kumtesën roli diasporës shqiptare në 100 vjetorin e marrëdhënieve diplomatike SBA Shqipëri. Ambasador Gashi, fjala është për ju.
Në fakt jam dilemë hamletiane me folë, mos me folë, sepse pas zotit Highland dhe një rezume ka gjanë që i bani raporteve kanë metë shumë pak fjalë për neve. Si do që tjetë, faleminderit për ftesën. Okay.
I want to hear what you're saying. I'm sorry to be rude, but it's important that I hear you.
He's going to say what you said.
Sorry, sir.
Po I numëroj, nuk pas kam shumë. Okej. Ja do të shkurtoj. Të nderuar zonja dhe zotri, vëllezër dhe motra, mërgata shqiptare është në themelet e çdo vlere të lartë kombëtare që kemi sot si në gjuhë, në kulturë, në arte, në politikë dhe në shtetëformim. Pa rolin e mërgatës shqiptare në botë, kryesisht mërgatës shqiptare në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës, sot fatet e kombit ton do të ishin krejt ndryshe. Që nga themelimi I Vatrës, e së bashku para saj Dielli, deri te Illiria, radio, televizionet dhe mediat e tjera në Amerikë, duke sugjeruar dhe duke orientuar shqiptarët që të mësojnë gjuhën, kulturën dhe traditën shqiptare, bën që të ndërtojnë ura miqësie me Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. Shqiptarët e Amerikës të regjistruar zyrtarisht janë që në vitin 1889 me Kol Kristoforin nga Katundi Kors, për të ardhur deri te ata që shkojnë sot e kësaj dite në Amerikë. Shqiptarët e Amerikës u bën pjesë e vetë Amerikës, duke marrë pjesë si Amerikanë edhe në luftën e parë botërore, në luftën e dytë botërore, në luftën e Vietnamit, luftën e Irakut, në gjitha luftrat që po ndodhin së fundmi krah për krah me shtetasit amerikanë. Shqiptarët e Amerikës gjithashtu u bën edhe emra të shuar në gazetari, në art, në kulturë, mjekësi, në avokati e tjerë. Duhet përmendim Ferit Muratin, Sefi për të papen, Nezmije Zajmin, Skënder Gjilagën, Samir e Pishtin, Bardhyl Tiranin e qindra e mira shqiptar që kanë bërë emër në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës u bën strej për patriotët shqiptar, cilët përndiqeshin nga sistemi diktatorial komunist në Shqipëri dhe ai pushtues komunist në Jugosllavi. Ata zhvilluan veprimtarinë e tyre patriotike në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës, duke filluar nga Mithat Frashëri, Abbas Kupi, Hasan Dosti, Xhafer Deva, Ago Agaj, Luan Gashi, Recep Mitrovica, vëllezërit Muli Osmani, Fuad Myftiu, Xhemal Laç, Yunus Ndreu e shumë patriotë të tjerë. Në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës gjendën gjetën strehen e tyre edhe shumë familje patriotike shqiptare, të cilat ishin të ndjekura nga sistemet komuniste në Shqipëri dhe në Jugosllavi, duke filluar me familjen Dreu, Balaj, Mirakaj, Kupi, Gjonmarkaj, Dine, Kaloshi, Perolli, Mulosmanaj, Biberaj, Zherkaj, Bayraktari, Berisha dhe të tjerët. Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës punuan natë e ditë për rrëzimin e sistemit diktatorial në Shqipëri, ku në balë të këtyre organizimeve pa dyshim që ishin shqiptarë e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës, gjithashtu punua dhe për lirinë dhe pavarësinë e Kosovës, mbrojtjen e drejtave shqiptarëve kudo që jetojnë trojet e tyre, në Maqedoninë e Veriut, në Medvez, Bujanoz, Preshevë, në Malzi, por edhe për drejtën e kthimit të pronave dhe të shëtësisë së shqiptarëve në Çamëri. Unë po shkurtoj sa më shumë, por dy elemente desha t'i përmendi që shpesh po i harrojmë. Kontributin e komuniteteve fetare në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës dhe të medjave shqiptare në Amerikë. Një rol të jashtëzakonshëm ka luajtur komuniteti ortodoks shqiptar, që nga Fanoli, atë Vaniçani, atë Stefan Lasko, deri te vëllezërit Liolini. I jashtëzakonshëm komuniteti katolik shqiptar në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës, duke filluar me Imzot Zeforoshin, Imzot Rok Mirditen, Dom Preng Dervashen, Dom Anton Këshiren e deri te Pjetër Popaj sot. E kemi edhe njërin prej sekretarëve të komuniteti këtu, njërin ndër personalitetet më të njohura që e kemi gjallë në komunitetin shqiptar të Amerikës, zotin Frank Shkreli, ish drejtues të Zërit Amerikës për seksionin e Eurazisë. Komuniteti musliman me një veprimtari të jashtëzakonshme duke filluar nga Sali Efendi Myftiu, Recep Kumbarqe, Imam Isa Hoxha, Imam Vebi Ismaili edhe deri te sot Tahir Kukaj, një personalitet jo vetëm i komunitetit shqiptar, por dhe institucioneve amerikane, është imami i policisë së New Yorkut. Komuniteti Bektashian shqiptar, duke filluar nga i përndritshmi Baba Rexhepi, Baba Arshiu e deri te sot Majriu, Baba Eliton Pashaj. Gjitha komunitetet fetare në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës kishin krye tyre burrat zot dhe gëzuar, besimtar të denj, por edhe patriot të vërtet. Këto komunitete fetare që shqiptarët e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës mos të asimiloheshin në kombe të tjera që fërkoheshin me fe. Rastet i kemi në Evropë që na kanë ndodhur asimilime të tilla. Rol të jashtëzakonshëm dhe të veçantë në lidhjen shpirtërore dhe politike të shqiptarëve me gadishullin ilirik. Shqiptarëve që jetojnë në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës dhe kudo në botë ka luajtur Radio Zëri i Amerikës. Zëri i Amerikës në gjuhën shqipe që nga themelimi deri më sot. Radio Zëri i Amerikës për shqiptarët kudo që jetojnë në trojet e veta etnike ishte zëri i shpresës, i lirisë dhe zëris vërtetës. Nuk mund mos përmendi disa nga emrat e shquar të gazetarisë së Zërit Amerikës, që u bën pjesë e çdo familje patriotike shqiptare në Shqipërinë e sunduar nga komunizmi erberist dhe në trojet shqiptare të sunduara nga komunistët panslavist të Titos dhe të klikës së tij. E mirë njohura Nezmi Ezajmi, Eles Biberi, Frank Shkreli, Shaqel Salihaj, Izabela Qoqoli, Laura Kondo, Doktor Faton Gashi, Iliri Konomi, deri te Vebi Bajrami dhe grupi i gazetarëve të ri që janë sot. Kemi edhe një grup të jashtëzakonshëm të gazetarëve shqiptarë që punojnë në media të tjera shqiptare në Amerikë. E kemi të mirë njohurin mikun e gjithëve Beqersina, Halil Mulajn që ishte këtu me neve, të ndjerin Dalip Greca, Muhamet Mjeku, të ndjerin Suliman Gashi, Hys Shkreli, Ruben Avgjiu, Rafael Floqi, Sokol Paja dhe dhjetra gazetarë shqiptarë në Shtetet e Bashkuara që po e mbajnë lart frymën e shqiptarisë tek shqiptarë në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës dhe lidhjen me trojet shqiptare në rajon. Roli mërgatës shqiptare në 100 vjet të marrëdhënieve diplomatike mes Shteteve të Bashkuara dhe Shqipërisë, por edhe 15 vitet pavarësisë Kosovës, ka shumë emra të përveçëm. Mos harrojmë, në gjithë librat e shenjtë monoteist abrahamik thuhet një fjalë e përbashkët: mallku qoftë mosmirnjohja. Neve edhe shteti i Shqipërisë, edhe shteti i Kosovës, po jemi shumë pak mirënjohës ndaj atyre, sidomos shqiptarëve në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës, se çfarë kanë bërë në lidhjet e tyre personale me personalitete të shquara të shtetit amerikan, duke filluar nga kongresmenë e senatorë, duke filluar me njerëzit në shtëpinë e bardhë, në Pentagon dhe në State Department. Unë do të përmendi disa emra që janë vetëm një pikë ujë në sqepin e zogut para oqeanit, sepse këta njerëz janë të shumë në Amerikë. Nuk po i përmeni personat që janë në sallë. Këtu kemi njëri që është njeriu më i afërt i shefit të gjitha shërbimeve sekrete amerikane sot. Ulur është këtu me neve. Këtu kemi njerëz që rrinë çdo ditë me kongresmen dhe senatorë amerikan dhe fjalë kryesore e kanë bashkimin e trojave shqiptare. Deshëm e zeshëm ne duhet ta themi me gojë plot. Por duhet u përmend shumë herë Fanoli, nuk përmend asnjëherë Fajk Konica. Fajk Konica, Antonio Athanas, deri te Gjim Gjema, Hari Bajraktari, Eles Biberaj, Ekrem Bardha, Arbreqi Joseph Djogan, vëllezërit Osmani, vëllezërit Bytyqi, Red Gjakli, Bruno Selimaj, Rustem Geci, vëllezërit Gojçaj, që e qunë në Terezën çdo cep të bocë, Turhan Rusi me të Sali Rusin dhe vëllezërit e tij. Richard Lukaj, Bruno Ceka, Din Derki, Dino Hasanaj, Ramadan Gashi, Martin Shkreli, Ramis Tafile, Skënder Perolli, Albert Elui Fundo, Nazar Mehmeti, Ilir Zherka, Avni Mustafaj, Mark Gjonaj, Elmi Berisha, e shumë personalitetet tjera që do duhej ditë, muaj dhe vite për t'i përmendur të gjithë shqiptarët e Amerikës që kanë kontribu për lirinë dhe demokracinë në Shqipëri, për lirinë dhe pavarësinë e Kosovës, për mbrojtjen e interesave kombëtare shqiptare në trojet e tyre etnike në Ballkan. Përveç Vatrës, që ka luajtur rol të jashtëzakonshëm, duke filluar nga Fanoli e Fajk Konica deri te Agim Karaxhoxhi, Dr. John Buçaj e sot Dr. Ilmi Berisha, rol të jashtëzakonshëm ka luajtur gazeta Dielli, që dje e ka pas edhe 114 vjetorin e lindjes saj. Histori suksesi në mediat shqipe në botë që 30 vjetë e këtej është Illiria e Vebi Bajramit. Një gazetë që është bërë emër kuptimi edhe kur ka qenë në print, por edhe sot e kësaj dite që del online. Harrojmë dhe nuk përmendim lobin shqiptar amerikan, që ka qenë shtyllë kryesore në fillim vitet 90 për takimet, për lobimet dhe për rreshtimin e shumë personaliteteve amerikane për të drejtën e lirisë së pavarësisë Kosovës, por edhe për demokratizimin e Shqipërisë. Rol të jashtëzakonshëm, duke qenë njëra ndër urat lidhëse me State Department, ka qenë Këshilli Kombëtar Shqiptar Amerikan. Për një kohë, kryetari i bordit ka qenë edhe zoti Frank Shkreli, që e kemi prezent këtu. Pa këto lidhje, pa këto takime, pa këta njerëz që i kemi këtu në sallë, dhe pa ata që i përmendëm e shumë që kanë vdekë dhe nuk i kemë përmend kurrë, dhe shumë të tjerë që nuk ja vdim as emrat, sepse shumë shqiptarë të Amerikës kanë bërë punë të jashtëzakonshme pa jo përmend kurkush emrin, pa e ditë kurkush se çfarë punë kanë bërë. Kemi dhjetra personalitete shqiptare që kanë punu për dy institucionet më të larta të sigurisë kombëtare në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës, për CIA-n edhe për FBI. Personalitete që në zemër, mendje dhe në shpirt e kanë pas çdo herë Shqipërinë, demokratizimin e saj, lirinë dhe pavarësinë e trojës shqiptare të pushtuara nga Jugosllavia dhe kthimin e çamve në vatrat e tyre sërgjushore në Çaberi. Pa këto lidhje, nuk do të njifte kur emrin Shqipëria shqiptar as presidenti Wilson, as Bob Dole, as Alphonse D'Amato, Benjamin Gilman, Chuck Schumer, Ted Kennedy, Elliot Engel, Tom Lantos, presidentet Bush, presidenti Clinton, zonja Clinton, presidenti Biden, sekretarja shtetit Albright, generali Clark, ambasadorët Walker e Wisner dhe shumë personalitete tjera. Pra janë to emra që e qunë lartë emrin shqiptar dhe i bën që të fluturojnë dallëndyshet e shpëtimit për lirinë dhe pavarësinë e Kosovës. pa këta emra dhe këta njerëz, pa Jim Gjemin, pa Hari Bayraktarin, pa lobin shqiptar amerikan, pa Vatrën, pa Këshillin Kombëtar Shqiptar Amerikan, nuk do të vinte në vizitë në Shqipëri James Baker, por nuk do të vinte asnjëherë në vizitë Shqipëri as presidenti George W. Bush, i cili nga Tirana, nga kryeqyteti zyrtar i shqiptarëve, lëshoi mesazhin e qartë: ka ardhur koha që Kosova të jetë shtet i pavarur dhe sovran. Edhe në ditët moderne dhe dëshmia më e freskët e shërbimit ndaj kombit që kanë bërë shqiptarët e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës është pjesëmarrja e tyre në luftën çlirimtare në Kosovë dhe në luftrat e tjera që kanë ndodhur në rajon. Batalioni Atlantiku është shembulli më i mirë. Sakrifica e vëllezërve Ylli Mehmet dhe Agron Bytyçi është shembulli më i madh i sakrificës. Si s'u ka imagjinohej dot fati i kombit nga përcyll të shekullit të kaluar, të atij shekullit 20, as sot nuk konceptohet e tashmja dhe e ardhmja jon pa kontributin e mërgatës son kombëtare, në veçanti të mërgatës son kombëtare në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. Pa rolin parësor dhe ndimin e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës, nuk do të kishim Shqipëri të pavarur, demokratizim të Shqipërisë në vitet 90, as antarësim të Shqipërisë NATO, nuk do të kishim as lirim dhe pavarësi të Kosovës dhe njohjen e saj nga shumica e shteteve demokratike të botës. Për gjitha këto, si dhe për lidhjet e thella dhe miqësinë me popullin dhe institucionet e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës, thellësisht dhe përulës duhet t'ju jemi mirënjohës për jetë mërgatës tonë në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. Presidenti historik i Republikës Kosovës thoshte: shtëpia nuk mbahet pa miq. Dhe këtë doktor Ibrahim Rugova e përsëriste çdo herë. Shqiptarët e Shteteve të Bashkuara të Amerikës më së miri e kanë dëshmuar dhe vërtetuar me vepër se miq më të mirë ne shqiptarët në shekujt e fundit i kemi Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës dhe popullin amerikan. Zoti e bekoft mërgatën tonë Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës, Zoti e bekoft Amerikën. Faleminderit shumë.
Ju faleminderit shumë, Zoti ambasador, për një kumtesë tejet konkrete, specifike dhe domethënëse. Ju e përmendet zërin e Amerikës, ne të dy i takojmë një brezi që jemi frymzuar për shpresën se liria dhe demokracia një ditë do të preke edhe trojet etnike shqiptare. Kam nderin që taftoj për fjalën e radhës zotin Frank Shkrelin, një nga ikonat e zërit liris dhe artikulimit çështjes shqiptare, jo vetëm si udhëheqës dhe përgjegjës në zërin e Amerikës, por si intelektual dhe veprimtar për 4 dekada me radhë. Zoti Shkreli, foltorja është për ju.
Shumë faleminderit. Do jem shumë i shkurt. Do të filloj me një citim. Freedom is coming, democracy is coming. Ishin fjalë e senatorit Robert Dole duke u larguar nga Prishtina në vitin 1990. Sot festojmë, o për nesër është 15 vjetori i pavarësisë Kosovës. Argumenti im në artikullin që kam përgatitur për këtë rast është se pavarësia e Kosovës 15 vjetori që festojmë nesër nuk do të ndodhte pa senatorin Dole dhe pa Jim Gjemin. Në atë mes duhet përfshirë dhe presidenti historik i Republikës Kosovës, Dr. Ibrahim Rugova. Duhet ta mbyll këtu në interesin e kohës. Fjalimin do ta botoj nesër në gazetat në trojën shqiptare edhe të diasporës. Gëzuar 15 vjetori i Republikës Kosovës gëzoni dhe festoni. Shumë faleminderit.
Ju falemderit për këto fjalë te domethënëse zoti Shkreli. Tani kumtesa e fundit për sot me duhet ta shkurtojmë agjendën e konferencës për shkak të angazhimeve edhe të delegacionit Vatrës, por edhe të mërgjimtarëve tjerë që i kemi këtu sot, në cilësinë e koorganizatorit të kësaj konference, ftoj për kumtesën e radhës, Dr. Elmi Berishën, kryetarin e Federatës Panshqiptare Vatra, roli mërgatës shqiptare në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës në krijimin e shtetit shqiptar dhe të Republikës së Kosovës, si dhe krijimit të partneritetit strategjik me Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës.
Edhe unë do mundohem t'jem e shkurt atë sa mundëm. Nderuar rektor, nderuar ambasador, të respektuar vatan, zoti Grishaj, Nazar Mehmeti, Emde Dushaj, zoti Shkreli, është nderë t'jem sot me ju, si do që tjetë, do të lexoj kumtesën, do mundohem t'jem shumë shpejt. Historia shqiptarëve dhe e SHBA-s daton që nga shekulli 19 dhe fillimi shekulli 20. Fillimisht nga migrantë shqiptarë, nga Shqipëria, organizimi dhe veprimtaria e tyre atje, pastaj pas luftës së dytë botërore, emigrimi shqiptarëve të Kosovës, të cilët së bashku me diasporën më të hershme shqiptare në vend, vetëm pak vite do të organizohen dhe do të vendos lidhje të forta me popullin dhe shtetin amerikan. Roli shqiptarëve në krijimin e shtetit shqiptar është më i rëndësishëm mbasën edhe vendimtari, tash i dëshmuar në analet e historisë botërore. Misia e kombit tonë me popullin dhe shtetin amerikan ka traditë mbi 100 vjeçare. Është tetë e rëndësishme takimi historik i Zot Fanolit me presidentin Wilson, që në analet dhe arkivat historike vlerësohet si një nga ngjarjet që pati ndikim të madh në shpalljen e shtetit të pavarur shqiptar. Përkundër rrethanave tjera të rënda gjeopolitike dhe historike të asaj kohe dhe apetitet e mëdha të fshinjve të Shqipërisë për të glabëruar territoret shqiptare. Miqësia Shqipëri-SHBA do të forcohet edhe me akte të tjera zyrtare ku shifet një kujdes i shtuar i administratës amerikane në atë periudhë të rënd historike për kombin tonë. Unë nënshkruan trakte dhe marrëveshje të rëndësishme bilaterale. Në vitin 1992, SHBA-ti japin Shqipërisë dhe shqiptarëve statusin e kombit më të favorizuar. Përpara njohjes së ndërsjellë zyrtare, Komisioni Amerikan Maxwell Blake shkembeu nota me presidentin e Këshillit dhe ministrin e punët jashtme të Shqipërisë, Qaferupi, për të siguruar statusin e ndërsjellë të kombit më të favorizuar në traktet e ardhshme tregtare midis Shqipërisë dhe Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. SHBA-ja që nga fillimi i viteve të 80-ta kishin përcjellë me vëmendje ngjarjet në Kosovë dhe ish Jugosllavi, shkeljen e drejtave elementare dhe shtypjen sistematike që regjimi serb bënte mbi shqiptarët shumicë dhe autokton. Rezoluta e parë për Kosovën dhe shkeljen e të drejtave shqiptarëve miratua në vitin 1986 në Kongresin Amerikan. Pas ngjarjeve të vitit 1989 dhe tensionimit të situatës atje, prapë SHBA do të jenë në krah të shqiptarëve. Vizita e senatorëve dhe kongresmenëve amerikan në krye me senatorin Dole shënon hapin e parë dhe historik të marrëdhënieve Kosovë-SHBA. Kërcënimi i këshillëndjellave i presidentit Bush në vitin 1992 drejtuar diktatorit Milošević, që sapo kalon vjegën në kuqe në Kosovë, do të përballesh me Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës. Shënon kjo një arritje kulminante të marrëdhënieve me partneritet strategjik në mes të shqiptarëve dhe SHBA-s. Vetëm 7 vite më vonë, ai zotimi i presidentit Bush do të realizohet në praktik me 24 mars 1999, kur aleanca më fuqishme ushtarake në planet NATO sulmon Saladeskën serbe dhe dëbon përfundimisht nga Kosova. Dimension të ri të marrëdhënieve Kosovë-SHBA shënon hapja e zyrës së SHBA-s në Prishtinë në vitin 1996, që ishte mesazh i fuqishëm politik dhe diplomatik nga administrata e presidentit Clinton për kujdesin dhe vëmendjen ndaj çështjes së Kosovës. Vetëm 2 vite më vonë, kur populli i Kosovës filloi luftën çlirimtare, përfaqësuesit e shqiptarëve të Kosovës në krye me presidentin Rugova do të pritën në shtëpinë e bardhë nga presidenti Clinton. Liria dhe pavarësia nuk do të arrijeshin pa ndihmën e pazëvendësueshme të SHBA-ve, por edhe të shqiptar-amerikanëve, që bën një punë titanike dhe kishin një rol kyç në këtë proces madhor për kombin tonë. Organizimi politik, konsolidimi, artikulimi i kërkesave në koordinim me udhëheqjen legjitime të shqiptarëve të Kosovës shënon një periudhë të ndritshme, efektive dhe me objektiva të qarta në realizimin e aspiratës së popullit të Kosovës për liri dhe pavarësi. Shqiptar-amerikanët jo vetëm që ndihmuan Kosovën në aspekte lobimit, politiko-diplomatik dhe ndërtimit të mesisë me shtetet dhe qeveritë amerikane. Ata nuk kursyen asgjë duke filluar nga ndihma të fuqishme financiare dhe logjistike në organizimin dhe ndihmësen e pakursyeshme të ushtrisë çlirimtare të Kosovës, jo vetëm në financa, armatim dhe logjistik, por edhe duke qenë pjesëmarrës aktiv të luftës çlirimtare përmes bijave dhe bijve më të zgjedhur në Batalionin Atlantiku, formacion ky që dha dëshmor për lirinë e Kosovës. Shqiptar-amerikanët pa dallim u bën urë fuqishme miqësie me institucionet dhe qendrat vendimarrëse në SHBA, sollën 24 marsin në vitin 1999 dhe 17 shkurtin në 2008-s, që është ngjarje më e rëndësishme kombëtare pas 28 nëntorit 1912. Duke qenë akter dhe veprimtare kësaj periudhe, një falënderim të madh ju shkon të gjithë burrave dhe grave të komunitetit tonë për një angazhim të jashtëzakonshëm në arritjen e aspiratës kombëtare të popullit të Kosovës. Në analet e historisë më të re kombëtare, angazhimi shqiptar-amerikanëve për kauzën e Kosovës në 1990-2008 do shënohet me shkronjat e arta se çfarë janë në gjendje të bëjnë bijtë dhe bijat e një kombi të lashtë për lirinë e mëdheun dhe trungun kombëtar. Të gjitha këto angazhime përpjekje që nga organizimi, solidariteti, financimi, jashtëzakonshëm dhe kontinuiteti i lëvizjes për liri dhe pavarësi të Kosovës kanë emra dhe personalitete të shuar nga komuniteti ynë, por edhe nga establishmenti politik dhe institucionet amerikane. Liria e Kosovës me 12 sheshor 1999 vjen me sfida të reja të ndërtimit, aspekteve ekonomike dhe sociale në Kosovë, por dhe sfida serioze politike për jetësimin e shtetit Kosovës. Edhe në këtë periudhë shqiptar-amerikanë dhe miqtë amerikanë do të jenë në krah të Kosovës. Kisha nderin që isha pjesë e një angazhime të rëndësishme si këshilltar dhe përfaqësues i presidentit Rugova pranë zyrës së sanatorit Doll. Angazhimit politike, lobimi dhe ndikimi të qendrave vendimarrëse në përkujdesin e senatorit Doll dhe mbështetjes së madhe nga veprimtari i shuar Gjimi Xhema do të rezultojnë me hapa konkret dhe veprime të qarta të administratës amerikane lidhur me statusin përfundimtar. Tani në prag të 15 vitorit të kremtimit të ditës së pavarësisë, Republika e Kosovës ka ende sfida përpara. Etapa e fundit është ndërtimi i institucioneve demokratike, sundimi i rendit dhe ligjit dhe proceset integruese euroatlantike kërkojnë angazhim serioz. Sens politik dhe diplomatik, dije, urtësi, por dhe miq të dëshmuar. Si komunitet shqiptar-amerikan vazhdojmë të jemi aktiv dhe në koordinim me institucionet e shtetit të Kosovës dhe japim kontributin ton që vërtet Kosova jetë histori suksesi. Përmbytja e dialogut me Serbinë me njohjen reciproke në qendër është shqetësimi dhe detyra jona si komunitet, që të bëjmë të pamundurën që kjo barrierë që po pengon antarësimin e Kosovës në organizata ndërkombëtare dhe në procese integruese të marrë epilog në favor të Republikës së Kosovës dhe të hapet faqe e re e perspektivës së zhvillimit ekonomik, social, politik dhe afrimimit të Kosovës sonë. Zëri ynë dhe aktivitetet tona në raport me institucionet qeveritare në SHBA, qarqet politike, analitike, opinioni publik dhe atë akademik, janë intensifikuar muajve në vjen në mënyrë që Republika e Kosovës në këtë fazë fiduese të dialogut për marrëveshje përfundimtare të ketë mbështetjen e fuqishme të Shteteve Bashkuara të Amerikës, ashtu siç e kishte në këto 3 dekada të fundit. Partneri strategjik dhe misia përhershme me Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës janë vizion dhe misioni ynë i përbashkët për një Kosovë stabile, demokratike, të zhvilluar ekonomikisht dhe prosperuese. Ju faleminderit.
Atëherë ftoj rektorin Hajrizi për fjalën përmbyllëse të kësaj konference.
Natyrisht nuk dua ta zgjas, po vetëm dëshiroj që ta marr fjalën që t'ju falenderoj gjithëve që patë durimin që treni dhe të jeni pjesë e kësaj konference. Siç po shihet, një konferencë shkurt gjysmëditore nuk mjafton që t'i prezantojmë kumtesat, patë edhe Christopher Highlands që kam përmbledh një përmbajtje të thellë me një literaturë review shumë mirë, po edhe me një përmbajtje personale dhe gjithë ju me përvoja dhe pjesën akademike profesionale. Për këtë arsye ne kemi folur me kryetarin Vata që të vazhdojmë me konferencat të tilla, me analiza, studime të tilla dhe të bëjmë një seri të aktiviteteve të cilat i qesin e pa edhe më mirë këtu veprime, këtu rezultate dhe këtu ndërlidhje që kanë shty në pavarësinë e Kosovës, në mbështetjen e Shqipërisë dhe gjithë shqiptarëve në përgjithësi. Unë ju falenderoj shumë. Dua në veçantë edhe një ta përshëndes këshillin e ambasadorëve shqiptarë sot që na kanë bashkangjit. Dhe ju falenderoj shumë për prezencën. Edhe një herë kryetarin, zotin Elme Berisha, të gjithë juve antarë, zotin Highland, faleminderit. Ne tash programin 2-3 ditor që e kemi së bashku, kemi ndu që masi ta përfundojmë, do të kemi një kafe, një pushim të shkurt, e di që keni kohën e drekës, po ne kemi përgatitur dhe një koncert nga Fakulteti i Muzikës Moderne që kemi këtu. Ata dëshirojnë ta festojnë 15 vjetorin, kanë bërë program, kështu që nëse keni kohë pak mund të kyçeni ose të jeni pjesë e saj. Vazhdojmë andej dhe shkolla mesme, se ekziston dhe një gjimnaz i cili ka dhe pjesën e vet, dhe në mbrëmje do të kemi koncertin kryesor me Filharmoninë e Kosovës, që i dedikohet kryesisht si program zyrtar 15 vjetorit dhe shpresoj edhe uroj që atje të shihemi dhe t'ju përshëndesim edhe një herë dhe të thashëm faleminderit shumë edhe mirësi.